Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with a special guest, Larry. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for doing the show. If you want to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening.
It's great, Larry. Hancock. My focus is on history. After college and a degree in anthropology and history, I went into the Air Force, had a fairly long career in communications and technology. After I retired, started writing. At this point in time, I think I have about 12 books and a half dozen monographs in print somewhere, and write on elements of national security, covert operations, but interestingly enough, for this podcast, also the national security connections to UFOs, and with a book called Unidentified, the National Security Problem of UFOs.
Okay, so if you could take me in the direction of why and when you became interested in diving into the subject of UFOs. Were you just looking through some government stuff or looking into some government history and realized that there was them looking into it as well too, and it kind of became this, I would say, ball of momentum of like, okay, I need to get interested into what this is, because if they're looking into it, there might be something there.
Yeah, and actually the interest goes, I became interested in UFOs in 1964. Okay, so it's nothing new. I was fascinated in the subject, read a lot about it, accumulated a lot of books, joined some of the early UFO organizations, was a member of NICAP, National Investigative Committee, Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, did a little field work, and then set it aside, followed it for decades, but kind of set it aside until I started writing on national security and getting, uh, basically, I'm a documents geek. I've collected and worked with tens of thousands of documents at the National Archives. And in writing on national security, that led me back across the path of what the intelligence community had been doing with UFOs in the very beginning in 1947, 1946. I write a lot about the origins of the national intelligence community, and that took me back into UFOs. And so basically, I spent 3 or 4 years researching that and putting together what the intelligence community's response had been to UFOs from the very beginning, which was quite different in the documents than their press releases. The bottom line is they took it very seriously, and we're taking it very seriously at the end of World War II for years, whereas if you read their press releases, it would be, oh, we looked into it and we didn't find anything, whereas their documents actually reflect the fact that they did high-level assessments and determined that they were indeed very real and very much a national security issue and a threat. Both the Air Force and the CIA at points in time issued internal memos referring to them as a priority national security threat.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a side question, then I'm going to go right back into that one. The side question is, through your whole entire investigation, looking through the archives, looking through all these documents, everything, do you think that the public has a I guess below expectation of how far the government actually is into a lot of things? Because I always tell people, like, the government's doing things that we don't even know about, that we think are 50, 60 years ahead. They're always looking into something, and we don't really get to, I feel like the general public, at least when I talk to people, they think that the government, no, they're not that far ahead. They're still on this level. I'm like, dude, they're like 4 levels past that.
Technology wise, I will tell you that even in the very beginning, the agencies themselves were puzzled. Like a group with Air Force intelligence might have been puzzled by the fact of, were they seeing something that was coming from another arm of the government? Was it a new technology development that they're not aware of? And there are lots of communications going back and forth, kind of like, I'm investigating this, and do I really have all the information? So it's not just the public that wonders sometimes, even internally, you constantly find today, the last 3 or 4 years, if you look at the most recent investigation, you'll find a lot of the communications are still befuddled. Is the Navy saying something that DARPA is testing, the Defense Research Agency? Or, they're always internally confused. So it's not just the public. I will tell you this, though, Robbie, from the very beginning, the assessments have always been that it's something real. But even at the very beginning in 1947, 1948, the assessments were that the technology, and when I say technology, the observable characteristics of what was going on was so far beyond anything that we had even under development that it could not be ours. At very first in 1947, 48, they thought that it might have been a Russian development based on World War II technology from the Germans. But when they did enough investigation to put that aside, they didn't have an answer. And quite frankly, one of the things that becomes obvious over the decades is we have no science, not just no technology. For example, when you look at the accelerations that were reported as far back as 1948 through 1950, we have no known materials that can stand that kind of acceleration. Stuff would just collapse at 900 Gs. So it's not just how do you do the propulsion, how would you even build anything that could stay together in some of the maneuvers and some of the accelerations that not just reported, but measured with technology, measured with radar, measured with optical instruments, now measured with infrared. So now I personally, after having looked at this role, I don't think the government has anything. I don't think we even have the science to describe what we see.
When it comes to what they were writing down in their documents compared to what they were giving out in press releases, how much did it differ? I mean, I understand, like, I always keep it in my head of like, yeah, you can't really scare the public on there's something that you can't explain. You kind of have to say, oh, it's this, or it's a weather balloon, or it's something like that. But this topic, it's very, very interesting, or this, I guess, question is interesting only because they've come out and said that there's things that they can't explain, which seems like it was the first time ever that the government has actually been upfront about what they know and what they don't know, which scares a lot of people. And I think this is what sparked interest in the whole UAP topic in general. They did slide it under COVID, so everyone was more worried about COVID than I think the topic really trending. But ever since Bill Nelson comes out there, I've spoken to Avi Loeb, I've spoken to a bunch of people who have kind of made these drastic discoveries. And it makes it even more confusing, where I feel like either the public is not even really super interested into it anymore. It seems like there's always another topic trending. I'm just curious, from what they've released or talked about now, knowing obviously they've made giant gaps and leaps forward in understanding what this is, but they're still, it seems like, at the start of what they were in 1947, where they're still wondering, like, I can't really explain this 100%. Or, in my opinion, that they're not being honest now, that they don't know what they're seeing, that they do have a good understanding of what they're seeing after all these years of development, but they're going to act like they did in 1947, instead of blowing it off, just saying we don't have any information.
Yeah. The routine answer from the very beginning, as you're talking about the disconnect internally versus externally,
Yeah.
the disconnect has always been, we know what we're seeing. I mean, there's the thought that the military itself or the intelligence community could not trust its own sources. It can't trust its own pilots. It can't trust its own instrumentation. Think about that for a minute. Like, if I can't trust my own military and my own data collection if I can't trust that about UFOs, I have a real problem, period. So it really is internally, they've taken it seriously. And they take it seriously on a couple of levels. More recently, what you see from the Navy in particular is they take it seriously because it represents a risk. It really represents a danger in some of their training areas where these things are, they're there. You can track them. You don't know what's going to happen next, but you're doing exercises. You're doing exercises with aircraft, with missiles, etc. It's a problem. So the disconnect has not been truly from the outside. It looks like they don't trust their data. From the inside, they do, and they literally don't have an explanation. I can show you memos that were written, and basically it gets to be internally, it gets to be kind of political. I mean, there's a memo written in 1949 by Air Intelligence that essentially says, yeah, this is real and we don't have an explanation. Okay, fine. That's not good. Your boss doesn't like to hear that. They don't like to hear that any more than Congress likes to hear it in 2022 when the military comes back and says, yeah, there's something there. We can verify that X% of these are unknowns and we don't know what they are. That's not Congress doesn't like that. The public wouldn't like it. Your boss doesn't like it. So the natural inclination is to kind of say that and get away from it as quickly as you can. Don't make any more comments. It only gets worse. Right now, Congress is really pushing that issue, and it's embarrassing. Before, quite frankly, Congress never pushed the issue. It never got to that point. There were people that wanted hearings. There were people that wanted legislation. The downside is Congress has now pushed the issue to the point where, once again, the intelligence community is forced to take it seriously, but what they're doing is taking it back underground. We're no longer seeing the reports. They're being classified. It wasn't elevated to become transparent because it is serious. And that's a clue right off.
What's the first document that was recorded?
There are air intelligence reports at the end of 1947 that say it's a real unknown phenomena. These are real craft, and they actually profile their flight characteristics and performance. At the end of the Air Force investigation called the Sign Report, there's another document that says, yes, they're real, and we don't have an explanation yet. At that point, the Air Force moved it into another level called the Grudge Project, which sort of might give you a clue. Somebody's not happy because they can't explain it to their boss. The upshot of the whole thing, I think, right, one of the most interesting documents is in 1952, after a wave of sightings across the United States, and a series of sightings over Washington, D.C., the president called a special meeting. We don't have the transcript of the meeting. The title, we do have the title. The meeting was called In Defense of the Capitol. And essentially, the president called the Air Force in and asked for an explanation of why this was going on over the Capitol, and we didn't seem to be able to do anything about it. The Air Force could not give him a decent explanation. Basically, he sent them away and took the issue to the CIA. We have the documents for the next 6 months that show the CIA becoming engaged with it. And actually, at the end of the year, the director of the CIA is requested to take the issue to the National Security Council.
Wait, so who has had the most time involved in the UAP subject, or the UFO subject? Who's had it the longest? The CIA, the NSA, the Air Force?
The Air Force definitely had it. The Air Force had it because what happened after the CIA became involved in it, short story is the Air Force and the CIA tried to elevate it up to the National Security Council. The National Security Council essentially said, we're not going to consider it unless you get some scientists to sign off on this. That didn't really happen. So it got booted back to the Air Force, and you had Project Blue Book for the next 2 decades, which was essentially an effort to collect reports and explain reports. It was as much as a public relations effort as anything else. Let's not worry the public. We know we can't explain this. Let's give them an avenue. The thing is, after Blue Book ended in 69, 70, there was no entity. If there were reports made, they stayed. We know there were reports made, but they stayed within the system. If the Air Force had a major incident at a missile base, it might have gone to the North American Air Defense Command, the National Military Command Center, but there was no centralized reporting, and it was responded to on a one-off basis. So in terms of long-term experience, one of the problems we have right now is, when Congress asked essentially the Navy, the Navy is responding simply to a series of incidents that they had over their ships in exercise areas, but there was no one place that Congress could go to. And there's still no sign as to what extent the Air Force is involved in this question now, or NORAD is involved, or I don't know that there's any sign that there's anymore a central body period dealing with it, even though they've said they're going to set one up. If they have, we have no visibility into it.
When it comes to, like, let's bring to the most, I guess, prominent example, which would be the Roswell incident. Are there any documents on the Roswell incident that you've seen that have caused you to think that it wasn't some? Because I've talked to a couple of people who've studied that incident, and they always say it's a weather balloon or it was something. Mostly they're skeptics that kind of say, like, it's not aliens, it's this. I'm just curious if there's any information out there, and if you have any, I guess, report or weight in the fact of they did lie to the public during their press meetings and make that one guy who was holding up the little pieces of tinfoil seem like a nut job or seem like a liar in a sense. Because, I mean, we all know the governments have actors. They have these types of agent provocateurs that are involved in stirring up disputes, and they happen during the riots and things of that sort. And I just always tell them, like, the government doesn't have to tell you anything. The government can literally just be like, no, we're not going to tell you this type of stuff. They're nice enough to give us information when we do a Freedom of Information Act, but I always suspect a little bit of malicious intent on a lot of these things, a lot of it because it's very, very hard for anybody to walk up and be like, I don't know, because then they lose faith in you. And that's the last thing you want, is your public to lose faith in you.
The term I would use, I probably wouldn't use malicious, but what I've seen through my life,
schemesters.
Well, no, I would call it CYA. Basically, cover your ass.
Yeah.
It is the first reaction is, okay, and this doesn't even matter to UFOs. It's anything. It's right. If I've got something that I can't deal with, I don't want to embarrass myself. I don't want to embarrass my boss. I don't want to look like an idiot, So it's like a defensive response. And Roswell's a good example of that, because it's a combination of two things, I think. First of all, anybody that is really interested in it, I would refer to Kevin Randall's book, Roswell in the 21st Century. Randall has done more investigation on that subject than anybody else. He's very pragmatic about it. There's another book by Carl Flock about it. The point is, even after like about 3 decades of investigating it, Randall himself has had to say most of what came out of those investigations was garbage. People were making up stories. There were outright hoaxes. The witnesses were unreliable. Yeah, something happened there. There's no doubt that something happened there. And I think Kevin would tell you, he's not comfortable with the answer. Personally, for a couple of reasons, I'm more comfortable with the answer being the fact that what happened was fragments of a stratospheric balloon test were recovered. And what was actually recovered that had to be covered up was essentially a sonic detections devices. At that point in time, there was a very secret project going on to put up high-level, constant altitude stratospheric balloons with these devices on them that essentially were sonobuoys. They'd been used by the Navy, but they were built to detect pressure waves. Okay. The reason the government was doing this is they thought they actually might be able to detect thousands of miles away the first Soviet nuclear explosions. And they were actually berserk to know when the Soviets had exploded a real atomic weapon. And so that testing was carried on. I think what happened was some fragments were recovered, probably of a balloon, but in that process, one of these devices called a sonobuoy was recovered. If that had been shown to the public, the immediate question is, what in the world is a Navy sonobuoy normally used to detect submarines doing out in the middle of the desert in New Mexico? And if you think about it for a bit, people that are quick, foreign intelligence, are going, oh, put that on a balloon, what could you do with it? The reason I think that, and Kevin doesn't, is we actually have remarks from more than one of the team members that were involved in the balloon launches, saying that when they got back to their base after some testing, they were told that one of their sonobuoys had been recovered, and that actually it was going to have to be covered up to make sure nobody knew what they were doing. So I think Roswell, something real happened. Yes, as you're saying, people were not given the full story, but as I find in most instances, something was indeed being covered up. And that was a classified, not that the balloons were a classified project, the fact that these sonobuoys, these acoustic devices, were being put on high altitude balloons, that was the classified part of the project.
I bet a lot of your information, maybe part of the reason why you also got interested in the UAP stuff and the Russian stuff as well too. I know we said we were going to save the Russian stuff for another time, but when you're searching things up about the Cold War and you're realizing that everything that you could really chalk up with UFOs or UAPs, it's all linked together. It's not like, I'm not saying aliens were involved in the war or anything like that. I'm just saying that when you're thinking that your enemy is doing stuff and you don't know their capabilities when it comes to technology or when it comes to war efforts, if you might see something up there that you can't explain in the air, you immediately assume it's going to be some type of tactic from the other side trying to invade, either spy or get some type of information from you. And that's the first thing that gets chalked into that box. And the next thing you know, there's a whole bunch of information. And later you find out, oh, this has nothing to do with this. This actually has to do with a separate thing. So we don't have time to investigate that right now. We got to focus on this and focus on that. So I'm not wrong in saying that's clear.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're absolutely right. It's intelligence practices. The practices are always at the root of it. If you don't understand the practices, you can't really discriminate what's mysterious, what's suspicious, whatever, from just routine, SOP, standard operating practice. And as I said before, one of the standard operating practices in almost everything is damage control. If something pops out of the bag that you don't know how to deal with and exceptionable, the first thing you always do is try to control the narrative until you can figure out what's going on, and you can come back in response. The response may be more or less uninformed, but first thing you always try to do is control the narrative, which is kind of, if you don't realize that, if you don't factor that into your study, then you can get lost really quickly right off the bat. But I think that really addresses it, not just to Roswell, but to some of the other things. The one thing I would add is, in those terms, the military, the intelligence community, Blue Book, even when it closed down the Blue Book studies and the Air Force exited the whole UFO thing in 1969, 1970, they left something like somewhere between 1,100 and 1,800 totally unexplained UFO reports out of the 22,000 whatever that they've gotten. And they never could explain them. And basically, it's like, how can you just leave this whole subject? And the response was, look, we've got a job to do. As of this date, after 3 decades, even though we can't explain them, we have never documented a single instance where any of these are a threat. We've never documented any aggressive action that we can confirm, and we have other things to do. I got to accept that. It's like, look, I've got adversaries. I've got real world people out there that are preparing to fight me. I've got a real job I've got to do. I got to put my resources in the right place. And even today in 2022, if you look at the response, it's like, well, yeah, we still have, we investigated 200 and, 80 of them we can't explain, but they're not a threat. So we'll keep looking at them, and so we're not going to ignore them, but they're not a threat. And that not a threat thing is a constant throughout all of it. The other thing that's a constant is, which nobody wants to say, yeah, they're there. We don't know what they are. They're not a threat. And by the way, we can't do anything about them. We can't intercept them. We normally can't track them routinely. When we attempt to engage them, even our best interceptors, whether it's 1952 or 2021, can't intercept them. So don't bug me. Like I can't do anything about them.
Yeah, when did they start reaching out to independent scientists to make their own panels, their own committees, their own little laboratories to start doing that? If I'm not mistaken, there's one called the Robertson Panel. The only reason why I know what that is because it's the same last name as mine. So I was like, oh, it must be related somehow. Yeah.
They started, the Air Force brought in consulting scientists as early as 1948, 1949 to take a look at it. They would bring in one of their contractors. They had labs, and they would take a look at it. One of the problems, of course, is I can remember one interesting report that's actually sent back to the Air Force about 1949, something like that, where it's an evaluation of whether or not these UFOs could be extraterrestrial. Could they be from Mars, whatever. And essentially the response, the scientists look at them strictly in terms of what we know how to do with rockets, and go like, no, they can't be aliens because these things aren't behaving about the way we would expect a rocket to behave. It's like, well, okay, that's, but sometimes the scientists could only give the best answer that they could give based on what they know, right? The panel that you're talking about, the Robertson panel, was convened after what I described to you earlier, when the president handed it off to the CIA took it seriously. The CIA actually said in its recommendation to their director that there are a series of incidents going on over our atomic installations in the Southwest United States that appear to be a threat. And the Air Force had already said that internally. So at that point in time, you got the Air Force and CIA in agreement. When they try to kick it upstairs, the pushback is, well, all you've got is a subjective assessment. I need a scientist to tell me that these are real unknown devices. And if they certify that they're real and physical and unknown, then we'll move it up. And the Robertson panel was convened to do that. I write about the Robertson panel in great detail in the book. The problem is they had a hard time recruiting scientists because scientists really didn't want to get involved in it. It's wasn't their business. They didn't see any academic gain from it. The funny thing is, even before then, the Air Force had one of their scientific consultants go out and do a covert survey, go to scientific meetings, and kind of just raise the subject of UFOs. And as it turned out, like, the majority of the scientists were interested privately, or some had even seen them, some were, but basically went on record even privately as saying, there's no way I'm ever going to touch this stuff because it would kill my career. There's just, I'm doomed. So I'm interested. And the same thing occurred with the Robertson panel. They had a hard time even getting anybody to sign on being on the panel. And when they got on the panel convened for, I think, had only convened for about 48 hours before they started writing their conclusion. They looked at a very limited number of body of material that was available. And essentially, basically, they stepped up the hard task that said, look, in any one particular incident that you've shown me, I cannot guarantee you, based on my academic reputation, that there could not have been a cause that we don't understand, meteorological, astronomical. In one instance, there's a statement that's saying, yes, this this appears to be so unique and so anomalous that we have no idea what could have caused it. It would be like a one-time occurrence in the history of the universe, but you never know. Maybe it was just a one-time occurrence. So they would not base their they're not going to write a report saying it's real. And the whole thing came to a grinding halt at that point in time. I don't, so it's not like the military or the intelligence community hasn't tried to call in scientists, but the scientists get stuck in the same trap that the Air Force did. The Air Force evaluated the phenomena, UFOs, UAPs, strictly on a one-by-one case basis. And if they couldn't 100% prove in something that was, anomalous, totally, not just a known, but an anomalous, then they just went on to the next case. The scientists ended up doing the same thing. And I think it's fair to say nobody ever studied this as a total body of evidence. They studied it on a one-by-one case basis and could never find a case where, as Dr. Hynek, one of the Air Force's consultants, said, the one thing we've learned out of decades of UFO study is any given scientist can always find an explanation for any given sighting, no matter how implausible it might be.
It seems like that's a big thing even now. It's completely shifted the opposite way when you look at how many scientists they're reached out to, and they're very, I guess, sparked up an interest, all because they're interested in the alien topic. But back in the day, you would basically lose your career. You'd be blackballed. It's like being blackballed from Hollywood from ever going on to a movie. Every institution would laugh at you. You'd have to have tenure. So if you look at a lot of these scientists and professors, they're all of, I mean, I try to look into a lot of these panels and see if I can find someone who was involved in them, but they're all died in like the 40s, or they all died in the 60s or something like that. And I'm like, yeah, because you would have to think you'd have to have your whole retirement and everything installed before you started doing this type of stuff, because nobody would want to touch it. They'd lose their career, then lose out all the money that their families are going to have.
And it hasn't changed that much. I know people now, I belong to a scientific coalition. We have lots of academics, but there are people even now who might join us and be interested, but have to do it. They can't do it until they have tenure. It's just like, okay, this is too dangerous to my career to even have my name published as being part of this organization. I'm at risk. Those that have tenure in some instances can take that shot at it. But I don't know if you've ever heard of Dr. James McDonald. Basically, he was an atmospheric physicist out of Arizona. He was one of the most prominent people in his field back in the 60s, became very interested in the subject, got into very deep research. And basically, there were people who went in the scientific community who went after him, kind of exposing them for even doing that. In the end, he was invited to testify to a congressional panel on something totally different, had to do with supersonic aircraft. Several congressmen laughed at him and grilled him and dismissed him because of he'd even expressed an interest in UFOs. In the end, Dr. McDonald, who had been an extremely reputable scientist, had his career destroyed to the extent that he committed suicide.
Damn. That's rough. That sucks, because even I don't know why. I mean, I'm happy that the times have changed where there's not that really kind of pointing and blaming. And if anything, you just kind of shrug it off in a sense. But I mean, you're destroying, not only like, people don't realize the words that they say. I mean, gunning after people. Imagine having a coalition of people that are just guaranteed trying to make sure that you never, ever get a voice or get an opinion or be able to publish anything. I mean, especially on something like this, where it's like you would like to get an answer, or at least have someone research, one person researching into it, even if you have a small group. Compared to that, just leaves more information for you to go explore and find another scientific discovery. I mean, it's manipulation, man. It's some mind games.
You would think that if anything, they would just ignore it. I mean, what's the point? If somebody is doing something you consider stupid, why make a crusade out of it? Just let them be. But it's been a very, I think, because the subject it's a trap. because UFOs are difficult to deal with from a scientific perspective. Science requires replication, right? You need experiments, you need controls, you need for the phenomena to be recurring so that you can study it. I mean, the classic thing is nobody believed in meteorites because they were kind of random and nobody observed stones falling from the sky. And then eventually in France, in one incident, several thousand fell from the sky in view of a lot of actually academics, and they couldn't reject it. But for the scientific community, it's a fundamental problem is that UAPs, UFOs have not been the kind of subject matter it deals with. I mean, science requires things that replicate themselves, that you can, they're going on, you can study them on an ongoing basis. You can do experiments, you can do controls, and it's something that you can do data analysis against. And UFOs have not been that way. They're predictable. They are kind of one-off incidents. So it's very much a challenge for the scientific community, period, which you can see kind of why they would want to avoid it. It's not subject material that works well for science. So the interesting thing is that that's also why it's a problem for the military. I mean, if it's not something that's happening on a routine, quasi-predictable basis, you can't engage with it consistently. You can't collect information on it. It's always a one-at-a-time thing. So it's difficult for both the intelligence community and the scientific community, probably more so for the scientists, because it's like if something just does happen randomly, one at a time, is that good content for your next grant or your next your next book that you need to publish and the next study you need to do? It's very difficult. Which quite frankly, Robbie, it's forced me back into dealing with it using a tool that comes out of the intelligence community called intentions analysis, which was developed strictly for these kind of topics, issues.
And how does that attention analysis go? Is that just sensing the intent of someone that's maybe pushing something a certain way, or is this having to do with because when you say intent, I start thinking like the intent of the aircraft that we can't explain, or are we talking about the intent of someone who's diagnosing what that aircraft is? Because if you're a scientist, and the way you just described to me about scientists not really wanting to try and say that we don't have an explanation for something, I go, the easiest way to chalk up one of these rare phenomena would be to say weather or some type of lightning ball thing, which I've said in the past could be more likely possibility than it being aliens, just because alien seems like the last step on the ladder, I would say. But government tech for me would be the first one. Maybe not tech that it's theirs, but this idea that they haven't manipulated a version of it. I mean, it's so hard now because you have so many people that are now seeing videos, and it's so hard to sort out the real through the BS. And it's only going to keep getting worse with technology, just social media and all these devices being able to manipulate farther and farther and farther to tell what a real thing is. But I also wonder how much of this is like, you ever heard of like the mass hysteria of all this, like it's called Havana syndrome that everyone was experiencing. I start going, how many people are like just wanting to see something cool like that, and what they see is a light in the sky, and next that light darts back and forth and they think it's aliens, and the next that's a recorded case right there that can't really be explained because it was that one moment and there wasn't a lot of people around to take a video or photo or something of that sort.
Yeah, that is a real problem. And two things I'd refer you to. One that you mentioned, and if your viewer is interested, here's an interesting book called Project Beta. Project Beta explores one of the things you just mentioned. And the fact is that there is technology. There are experiments, that need to be covered up and classified to prevent giving information to an adversary. In this particular instance, and this has happened before, it happened for those, we talked about Roswell and those balloons and the sonobuoys, that would be an instance of, whether there was disinformation as part of a legitimate development activity. It's happened before with Air Force projects like the U-2 or the SR-71. Actually, at one point in the time, the Air Force was trying to convince everybody that what they were seeing were U-2s at very high altitudes. And yeah, don't worry about them. They're not really UFOs. And they were developing the next generation SR-71. So we prefer you think that they're either really UFOs and not our new aircraft, or they're one that we already have that's very hard to see. So that does go on. In this Project Beta incident back during the Star Wars days of the Reagan administration, there was some really advanced technique stuff being developed for high resolution photography of satellites using laser beams, special optics, etc. It's being conducted near Albuquerque at Kirtland Air Force Base. And a local scientist, actually a fellow who ran an engineering company, engineer more than a scientist, started seeing it from his home in the foothills and reported it to, it's like, okay, I'm going to report this to the Air Force because it looks like there are these UFO things over your base and you should know about them. Do you know about them? Should you be worried? And so they engaged with him because he was reporting something that was extremely classified. Unfortunately, members of the UFO community also engaged with him. It turned into a nightmare of feeding disinformation to him to cover up what he was seeing, to feeding disinformation through the UFO community to try to prevent open collections by foreign intelligence groups, which if you think about it, that's a great way to get intelligence on new developments is, what are you people seeing that you think is mysterious? We want to look at it. In the end, this fellow also committed suicide. Very tragic story, but it's a good illustration of why you have to be very cautious. You probably heard about them, the reptilians, the underground bases, all of that fed out of this disinformation campaign, and it's still with us.
I don't know who the people believe that they're reptilians or something like that.
It's sad, and they do. I mean, the other thing that I would recommend if people really want to do due diligence,
you better have your book to bring up too.
Oh, I should do that. It's a book
come
by
on.
Kevin Randall and others about abductions.
Yeah.
Really, really good. Okay, let's show my book then.
Yes.
Unidentified, the national security problem of UFOs, which it's two things. And that kind of leads us back in the other. This answers, Unidentified answers a lot of your questions about what the intelligence community did over time, what the Air Force did over time versus what it said. Okay, what's the real history of the documents versus the PR releases? And then it introduces this concept of, I think the only way that you're going to tackle this and avoid the kind of one-off issues of looking at it case by case by case by case and never finding the perfect case is it takes back to a tool called intentions analysis, which was developed during the Cold War to deal with instances where your adversary, primarily the Russians or the Chinese, whatever, were doing things that might be a threat, that might indicate military preparations, goes all the way back to the Korean conflict, but they're trying to conceal them from you. You have bits and pieces of information. You have to deal with disinformation. How do you get a grip on what's going on and whether it's real or not real or indicative? It never gives you a concrete answer. It simply gives you a probability. It gives you an assessment. It's subjective. Scientists don't like it because it's subjective, but it is a technique that's been developed and refined. It's used in business, in marketing and in business strategic planning when you're trying to figure out what your competitor's doing. It's used in the intelligence community. And this is an area I'm working with now and discuss in the book about the basic technique is you got to have a lot of history. You got to build a baseline. You got to collect a bunch of fairly solid data over a period of time and then start looking for anomalies, because the information is always in the anomalies. What's different than what it was. What is that going to be significant? Do we see it again? Do we see a pattern? Pattern analysis is a big part of it. But it really hasn't been. If the intelligence community is using it on UFOs, there's no sign of it. Usually in the intelligence community, it's used at the very highest levels of things that are on the national priority tasking for intelligence. UFOs have never made it up there, and I don't see any sign that they're making it up there now. So I'm actually involved with a team now that is using this technique. We've built an extensive database of looking at tens of thousands of UFO reports, parsing it down to a few hundred that are quite concrete, and using data reduction techniques, pattern analysis techniques to see if we can identify any long-term patterns of behavior that would be a clue to intentions related to UAP activity. You ask what the intentions part of it means. Well, if you do find those anomalies, then there's a whole process you have to do to review different scenarios, look at indicators. And finally, what you end up saying is you write a white paper to your boss. If you're in the intelligence community, it says, okay, boss, we've looked at this and we're concerned, or we're not concerned, and we think this may indicate A, or it may indicate B. And it's an advisory. It's kind of like, this is the best we can do. We can't guarantee you. We don't have any 100% confidence. We simply see the probability that something may be happening.
Are you taking into account the time period as well too? Like we talked about in the beginning about people being hesitant to be involved in something like this. Like when you read documents, how many of those 10,000 documents that you could skew down lower, how many of those documents that you don't really consider because you start looking at the fact that maybe they didn't want to jump the gun on something, or maybe there was a political intent? We could bring it back to that as well too. And then also, how many of them are incubated questions or incubated documents? When I say that, I go, how long until that egg timer clicks to 0 and then we finally get that information out later? People don't realize that, like, a lot of people with these government documents, they knew when this full information was going to come out, but they made sure it was way past when they weren't going to be alive anymore. So I wonder how many of that in your analysis. I mean, because you are an expert in this sense, you've looked over plenty of documents to be able to be entitled for that for sure. So I wonder, what do you see the large majority get skewed to when it comes to the information or the documents that you're reading? Are you seeing a large, massive amount of political invasion? Would it be better if they just kept the gates closed for as long as possible and never gave us anything, so maybe people didn't have to stick their hands into it, and then you see a bunch of disinformation spreading? Because I'm a free speech guy, but I also see like why the government can't tell you certain things. But I just, as long as that doesn't impede on my decisions, it doesn't really bother me. If it's something I don't need to worry about, like aliens, that's something it's not interfering with my life at this moment. So I can see if that information comes out later. I can't be mad at something I didn't know about. You know what I mean?
No, I'm totally what you're saying. And maybe if I describe how we're collecting the data, I think it will answer your questions. First of all, our study period is 1945 to 1975, 30 years. Okay, so that's a reasonably lengthy period if you're going to see any patterns emerge. What we have done is, if the data that we're using, primarily, I'd say 80% of it comes from the Air Force's own files. And these were contemporary files. These were reports that were handed off to the Air Force from its own personnel, from its own pilots, real time at the time. So when I'm looking at a document, actually, it's very likely that that document itself was held at some level of classification for decades. It was an internal document with the Air Force. The only reason I can see it now is when the Air Force closed its project in 1970. It took all those files. It's like, okay, we're going to archive them. We're going to put them into the Air Force archives. And fortunately, they were also put on microfiche. Okay. And some very diligent UFO community researchers have ultimately located them on those microfiche files and transcribed them. So my essential database, that we're using consist right now of something like 1,200 reports unidentified. Okay, these are the ones that they couldn't explain out of 24,000 that they collected over that period of time. They're taken from the original source documents. And like I said, they were primarily reported from inside the military, but there are a number of law enforcement reports that got in that way. So these pretty solid. Basically, our rule of thumb is what we want is a report that was legally actionable. In other words, if a military person made the report, they were at risk. They had violated military law if they reported something false. So this was a serious report from inside the military. The same thing is true from an airline pilot, even true for a private pilot. If you go into the laws relating to this reporting, even a private pilot under what's called service reporting, they had to report it, were expected to report it, and they couldn't talk about it. From around 1953 on, all the Air Force could do was acknowledge that they'd had a report and they were investigating it. But the people who made it were not supposed to talk about it. So these are not the typical reports that you see in a lot of UFO books. So first of all, the data is relatively solid. It was collected over a period of decades, and we're using the hardcore data especially. And now we've taken it into a database. We spend a lot of time vetting it for duplications, but I think maybe that addresses some of your
Yeah.
questions into where the data comes from, how reliable it might be, and how we grapple with that question. And now we're to the point, and by the way, we're looking at it in multiple domains. We use controls to try to determine where an incident is anomalous or not compared to the controls. It would be too long-winded to tell you what the controls are, but the bottom line is the first thing that we're studying literally is UFO activity associated with the American Atomic Warfare Complex and aerospace development sites. And that leads us to consider, I think, the body of data that we're dealing with, those reports that we're studying have to do with something over 100 military bases and test bases, like whether it's White Sands or Cape Canaveral or, Muroc Air Force Base,
Yeah.
which was an advanced aircraft development base. But we've really tried to boil it down, to something that's manageable. We may study other domains, other areas later, but that's what we're dealing with at the moment.
Have you come across any documents that reference Area 51 or Bob Lazar? I know people dismiss Bob Lazar's story, but I don't really see a whole lot of issues with it. But if you talk to the UFO community or UAP community, they have huge issues with his story. They call him a hoax or a liar. To me, it just looks like a person that ran their mouth and then might have gotten a little bit of forgiveness in a sense. And that one doorway, I would say, to forgiveness meant that he had to come out and say that everything he said was a lie. There's other voices out there that I've seen on UFO Twitter who make a living off of promoting that they're involved in the UAP for the government. And those to me are agents of disinformation. Especially there's articles coming out about, seagulls or somehow this UAP spy device and all this type of stuff from prominent figures too, people I've had on the show, good people. But it's just like, man, like you're that's something that's a little bit too far out of the realm of basic of what I would consider evidence. So I'm just curious if you put any weight into Bob Lazar's story, if you've heard his story, or if you've mentioned or seen any documents that happen to do with Element 115 or Area 51 in general.
Well, certainly I've seen the documents. I've seen a lot of documents that relate to Lazar himself, including his arrest records, including his file in that regard. I've seen a lot of things related to Area 51. What I tend to, and I know people, one of the problems is the Lazar story isn't just the Lazar story. Quite frankly, the Lazar story got picked up and expanded tremendously by a couple of other people.
Joe Rogan.
Yeah, and so it's hard to, you got to separate Bob from the total story.
He seems like a good guy
They,
to me.
yeah, I'm not going to say the man is not sincere. I'm not going to say he heard something or saw something. One of the problems, though, is, and that's one of the reasons I brought up Project Beta. We know that there have been cover stories put in place to cover actual developments of secret aircraft, secret devices. There's a lady whose name I don't remember off the top of my head, but she wrote a book about Area 51. She's a journalist, has no skin in the game. In writing the book about Area 51, she happened to interview this fellow, old guy in his 70s, 80s, who had worked there back in the day when they were supposed to have the alien spacecraft and a few bodies and, okay. And he told her, what's a fascinating story. Basically, he told her that there was a cover story put in place that actually what had been recovered at Roswell were genetically, well, actually, they weren't that. They were, I think, supposedly prisoners of war who had been subjected to radiation experiments. And the Russians had essentially carried out a psychological operation where they had crashed this device with these bodies in New Mexico to make the US think that there were aliens and have the US intelligence community totally devoted to finding out what these aliens were.
I'd buy that. I'd buy it.
This is in her book. Okay. So she took him, and I think he believed it. The question is that a third tier cover story? Clearly there's reason not to believe it. I mean, that it's a great cover story. I love it. I mean, and there's an English reporter who's written another spin on it saying, no, that was really an American experiment using prisoners of war that have been subject to radiation experiments. You can always come up with a cover story for another cover story for another cover story.
I know it's hilarious because since Elon bought Twitter, there's been a disinformation committee put in by the government. I was like, everything they say has been like manipulative. Like it's literally like the pot calling the kettle black. Like it doesn't make sense. There's a lot of stuff. Like I feel like a lot of the information, especially all these topics that are trending, all these types of things, all this has been like a litter of just information. If you look back at anything in history, try and find one side or anything to anything. There's non-existent. There's a billion sides. It's not just the amount of perspectives that are out there. It's the amount of just information that's everyone's building up their own story. And then with time, it gets worse. See, your memory, it's so hard to recall things where you'll start adding details and stuff. Like I think it was an October 2nd night. Next thing you know, you're at a basketball game with Michael Jordan and you don't even like basketball.
Yeah, I know it's funny. In looking at my books, I write about covert operations. I write about political assassinations, but I'm on a forum, okay, with guys related to JFK assassination.
I had James DiEugeno on the show.
Oh yeah, Jim's an old friend of mine. But somebody made a post and they said, well, so-and-so has posted 5 threads on this one topic, so he must have an agenda. And my response is, if we took everybody who had an agenda off this board, there would be no content. Like, why do you think he's any different than you are? It's like, yes.
Look, we got to get into the JFK. Hold on, we got to get into the JFK topic real quick. We have to.
On the UFO behind me, I have a shelf. Over the years, I've probably owned, read, purchased, I would say easily 80 to 100 UFO books. So people ask me how many of them I would recommend. I'd say about 4. Yes, I read them all. I'm familiar with it all, but a lot of it is just dialogue. I'm not saying it's not even true, that they're not sincere, they're whatever, but I can't do anything with it, which is why I tend to be either, I tend to be into the contemporary history. If you want me to, I've got to look at my source. I've got to be comfortable with my source, and it can't just be a narrative. I've got to have some data. I've, which is what we just discussed. When I'm working with a report that I know was made in 1953, and I can look at the original document itself. One of the things that boggles my mind is that people, I have never found any evidence that anybody had the time or energy to go back and replicate a whole series of hundreds of documents that relate to something to falsify it when those documents were classified in the first place. It's like, how much, who has the time to do that? Now, one or two documents, you want to talk about MJ12, that's another story.
The Majestic 12?
Majestic 12. Yeah. Are there some fake documents there? You bet there's some fake documents there. I mean,
It's cool to
yes.
think that's real, though. I like that one just because it's
Oh, I
like,
loved it.
oh, there's a
I
superior
loved all
team
this
out
stuff.
there.
I loved all this stuff. These are great stories. It's become much less entertaining over the years.
Because you're involved in it so much, you got to be like, where's the real stuff? Like, I'm tired of looking through a document. The next thing you know, towards the end, you're like, oh, damn it, there's an ending and it has the credits and everything like that. Like, you don't like that.
And that's exactly where I am. I'm now down to, okay, I've done that. I've been there. Same thing on JFK. I must have had 200 JFK books over the years. How many do I have them now that I refer to? Half a dozen. You know, I loved them all. It was great, but you know, I can't. At
JFK.
the
Oh,
end,
hold on, stop. We got to get
yeah.
to JFK. There, you can't say that there isn't something going on there. Come on, with the amount of like the chain of custody that's messed up, with the amount of how they only interviewed one witness that went down the steps when there was two there, with the amount of the brain mass being off, with the photos being off that are implemented into the archive. There's just so much there that when someone tells me, no, there's no conspiracy behind it, there's none of this, I'm like, when has the government ever put your intentions or the right for you to know ahead of their own nefarious gain? Like, I'm sorry, that just hasn't happened through history. It's why we have all this information, all these topics that still trend today.
But, and I guess having written, I think it is now 4 separate books on the Kennedy assassination, one on the King assassination, and one virtual book length white paper on the RFK assassination. Yeah, all of those were conspiracies. All of those were crimes. All of those, but there's one thing that's in common with all of them. And we talked about it earlier here. One of our problems is the first response of what I would call the establishment. Remember, I'm out of the 60s, okay? We were dealing with the establishment. That was the term then.
Burn it down, man. Burn it down.
Now it's like the deep state or the government or whatever. It's kind of like, okay, fine. You didn't like our word, you use your own word. Okay. The first response you see in each and every case is what I would call damage control. It's narrative to seize the story. Because if you look at all those instances, quite frankly, somebody failed. I mean, a president got assassinated. People that were assigned to keep him safe failed. You know, the Secret Service failed. The FBI failed. There's failure. So right off the bat, okay. So, and there's failure and then there's fear. So the first thing is to seize the narrative. I think one of the most obvious cases of that is in the King assassination, where after the head of the FBI, Hoover, and the Attorney General both issued a statement within 24 hours that there was no conspiracy. It had been done by a lone gunman, and you guys should relax and not have these riots. Stop these riots. They were, I mean, there was a national wave of riots. I was there. You know, it was scary. After the fact, they both admitted, no, we didn't know that. It was damage control. We're trying to stop, you know, fear, panic, riots, whatever. After the Kennedy assassination, I mean, there were first two thoughts were, A, it was either a coup or it was the Russians. and we might be engaged in atomic warfare within, 2 hours. We need to seize the narrative. And it wasn't the Russians. It was a lone nut. I mean, within 48 hours, it has to be a lone nut. Why? Because we don't know what it
Yeah. You
was.
got to wrap it up.
We got to wrap it up. We got to get control. So that's the first thing you always have to deal with. So I think, right, one of the things that I would say, yes, all of those, there's something at the heart of all of these things, but you have to assume there's a certain set of reactions that are going to occur. There's going to be CYA, there's going to be denial, there's going to be damage control. But one of the terrible parts of that damage control is by the time you're finished with it, you can't tell the truth, right? Because I told you to make you feel better. I told you there was no conspiracy and there was no, it was a lone nut. Now, if I actually investigate this and find out something different, what am I going to do? Am I going to put it all in this one file that nobody should ever really see because I lie to you all the time? Even in your best interest, right? It's like no fear and panic and running in the streets. No, I don't do that. Okay. It's funny what we do see is during this process, when they kind of find indications and leads that there are conspiracies, they back away from it because you really don't want to know. For example, in the Robert Kennedy assassination, we can see over a period of like 8 weeks, 2 months, where they absolutely knew there was a conspiracy. The witnesses told them it was conspiracy, but they could not find the people. They couldn't solve the case. They had witnesses telling them and identifying 2 or 3 people who had been observed with Sirhan. Yes, these people were involved. They couldn't find them. Guess what? They start writing off the leads. And I go back and find dozens of leads that are written off, not to be investigated anymore for a certain reason, which proved to be bogus. But it happens every time. It's almost like, yeah, we'll do damage control and then we'll investigate it. But if we start finding things that look dangerous, let's back away. And in the Kennedy assassination, I think a perfect sign of that is that immediately following the assassination that day, November 22nd, J. Edgar Hoover ordered the FBI to conduct a full open-ended investigation. Look at all your sources. I don't care where they are, subversive, criminal, ultra right wing, look at them all. Look at everybody. By Saturday morning, he issued a new directive saying only investigate leads that are directly connected to Lee Oswald. Lee Oswald is the guy. If you can connect somebody to Lee Oswald, we're interested. If you got a lead saying someone else was involved, not related to Lee Oswald, don't waste your time. And FBI agents that I've interviewed have said they knew what that meant. That do not start poking into corners. That's a career risk. The director wants to hear what the director wants to hear. Go find it and don't look elsewhere. Don't poke places that are not in line with that directive.
You're gonna have to come back on and we'll have to do another episode on JFK. I didn't know you're interested in that. That's insane. Oh God, that one to me is like when people say that there's no conspiracy behind it, I'm just like, hold on a second. Like, there's no way that I'm drinking from the crazy water. There's got to be something there. I mean, it's just clear for me, but everyone else likes to turn their head and have a blind eye. But I get it. It's a lot of topics. But Larry, it's been
I guess the good thing for me is I haven't reached a definitive conclusion on the UFO thing yet. Okay, still working on that. As far as JFK is concerned, I did publish a book last year that pretty much resolves it for me and resolves who was behind it to a pretty finite level of detail in terms of individuals. The book's called Tipping Point, and the book also explains what motivated those people to do it and why they had to do it in Dallas and why they had to do it at a particular point in time. Uh, it's titled Tipping Point because, like, what was the straw? What pushed them over the edge? What would push these people to kill a president? And that's why the book is titled as it is. So at least for myself, I've gotten some closure on that one.
Well, I'll link that book in the description as well too, and then also your other book as well too that happens to do with UAP stuff. That's going to be in there. And do you have a Twitter, any social media links, or anything that anybody can reach to you
I
on?
do a WordPress blog, just Larry Hancock on WordPress.
Okay.
Uh, that's what I do primarily. I'm happy to use my email for questions if people have questions, but I'm still I'm like totally wrapped up in this UFO intentions research, and I am still closing off one or two
I'll keep it to
JFK
myself.
leads.
I'll keep it to
So, like,
myself.
know.
I'll link it all in the description, Larry. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the